can we eliminate waste in the sense of energy that does nobody any good whatsoever, that doesn't achieve even any measurable purpose.
Solar and wind products need to connect with transmission lines, and electric grids need to be scaled up with the increase in power required for electric vehicles and heat. A full transition to electricity will require a threefold increase in energy generation by 2045. But is this likely or even possible? Can we actually replace rather than augment fossil fuel use? With me today is Sascha von Meier, an independent consultant in the energy field, specializing in the electric grid. Formerly adjunct professor of electrical engineering and computer science at UC California, Berkeley, and energy management design professor at Sonoma State University. Sascha also directed the electric grid research group at the California Institute for Energy and Environment. She's the author of the textbook, Electric Systems, A Conceptual Introduction. Sascha's based in California. Sascha, can you help us with the energy crisis here?
Hi, Dale. Well, boy, I sure hope I can. There's a lot of really smart, really good people working on that problem, and it's a big problem. It's a big challenge. It's an exciting challenge because in the energy field, I think there's so many positive, proactive things that we can do that are within our technical means to do if we have the commitment and the will to do it. I want to start by pushing back a little bit on your opening statement where you said, we'll need to expand generation by threefold. I don't think that's a given. You're absolutely right that there is hopefully a huge increase in electric loads that we're transitioning off of fossil fuels, right? And that includes transportation, EVs, which, it's good to keep in mind that one electric car for, the number of miles that most people drive is just about equivalent to the entire rest of your house in terms of its electricity use, certainly in terms of its peak electric demand in kilowatts, right? So EV charging is a big load, and then electrification elsewhere for heating purposes, would be awesome if we could transition natural gas, space heating and water heating over to highly efficient electric heat pumps, which work really well in most climates. So those are all added loads on the electric grid, but I don't think that it means we have to triple our demand, because at the same time as we're adding new kinds of electric loads, there are still improvements in efficiency that we can get. And, that is true for heating and cooling. For instance, so much we can do with just better insulation, better efficiency inside the house, using more passive solar design for new buildings. Of course, retrofitting, there's only so much you can do, but also with efficient motors and so many different kinds of energy efficient appliances. I think that, we won't be able to quite make up for the increase in loads, but we can counteract it to some degree.
Well, a lot will depend on if we actually don't add to fossil fuels, if we're actually replacing fossil fuels. And that's what we haven't been doing so far. We've just been adding and adding and adding to the amount of energy we use. So a lot of this will depend on people using less energy. Transmission lines are fragile. How does that play going forward?
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack here. Let me respond first to the very first point that you made about energy use. And, people having to use less energy. And I think it's really important to clarify a couple of distinctions. And one is that with energy efficiency, even if you're consuming fewer kilowatt hours or BTUs, that doesn't mean you have less energy services. So, there is an aspect of energy conservation, which implies that you're, trying to scale back and be more modest. But energy efficiency doesn't require us to really give up on any of our comforts and conveniences or standard of living, right? It means achieving the same results with less waste. So that's an important point. The other is
there is a lot of wastage in our system. There's a lot of luxury items. There are heated swimming pools. There are innumerable huge houses that use gobs of energy. Surely there's some adjustment to be made.
Sure, right. But and I wholeheartedly agree, right? Do we really want to be building mansions with, huge numbers of square feet that are heated and cooled and nobody's even using it? But so it's really important to distinguish that from energy efficiency, because you're asking people to make conscious choices about what's important to them and what they want in their lives. That's a different conversation than the conversation about, can we eliminate waste in the sense of energy that does nobody any good whatsoever, that doesn't achieve even any measurable purpose, but just goes out as waste heat. So just to give you one example, in lighting, we can talk a lot about the waste of things being lit up, especially at night, when they don't need to be. One of my pet peeves, right? So that would fall under energy conservation to say, maybe we don't need to light this up. Energy efficiency would be replacing wasteful incandescent light bulbs, or today even fluorescents, which aren't as good, with high efficiency LEDs. So you get more lumens per watt. You use fewer watts, less energy for the same amount of light. So you don't even have to go into the conversation about having less energy services. We can already, just with efficiency, scale down. But I personally agree with you that both conversations are worth having.
Well, you mentioned about light pollution is very damaging to wildlife. And,
right.
So, if we could not have, I've seen highway lights where the reflectors are on the side of the road. And as the car comes in with its headlights, the reflectors serve to light the road.
Yeah. So then to come back to the other point you made, which was about the peak demand, right? So there is also, separate from energy efficiency, is this ability to be responsive in our demand and to shift our peak electric demand, which is going to be really helpful and necessary for the electric grid. And, when you think about it, there are a lot of electric loads that we don't really care exactly when we're using them. I don't care exactly at what time the dishwasher runs. I don't care exactly what time my electric car is charging up, as long as it's within some parameters that I can set. So especially with many of the newer loads that, may also be remotely controlled with a phone app or something, there's a lot of flexibility there to shape the demand into something that's more congenial for the electric grid for the resources.
Well, let's talk a minute about catastrophes, because we're going to have them, whatever we do.
Oh, yeah.
And California, where you live, has seen quite a lot recently. It's quite shocking what's been going on, not to mention the Midwest, where these tremendous tornadoes are suddenly, destroying places. Preparing for that in advance would seem to be essential. Having community centers. What do you think about that? Can we get that together in this society?
Well, I think we have to, and the sooner we do it, the more thoughtfully we can do it, and effectively, and probably less expensively. I mean, at this point with, the crazy rain and snow we've been having, and this after the years of really depressing drought, it's sort of anyone's guess what comes next. But, from the climate science point of view, there's no reason to think that things will get any easier, right? There's no reason to think that, oh yeah, this year was a crazy anomaly and now things will mellow out. That would be a gambler's fallacy. But I think things will probably get worse and more extreme. And with the weather, it's not just the extreme temperatures or amount of precipitation, but it's also the lack of being able to forecast it accurately in advance. That's actually very costly, excuse me, for the electric grid and in other places. So as far as disasters, we'll probably have them. And I agree with what you said that, preparedness is key. And I think that in the context of the electric grid, we need to be thinking more about people than about the technical system per se. In an ideal world, it would be wonderful if we never had failures of the electric grid, if we never had power outages. Given that we will have power outages, and most of them are locally caused, whether it's wind or trees, stuff like that in the distribution system, or whether it's something more serious, more widespread or regional in the grid, it's going to happen. And so I think in terms of trying to build our resilience with respect to those failures, and, to be honest, it's not just weather. There's any number of other threats, including intentional attacks, that could happen, where is just not feasible to have a grid that's, arbitrarily well protected against anything that somebody might throw at it. It can't be 99.99999% reliable, because those last nines are going to cost you disproportionately more money. So it doesn't even make sense at a societal level to try to just reinforce the grid. We have to think about making power outages survivable. The first priority is to make sure that everyone who's got some essential need for electricity, whether it's life supporting medical equipment, or they can't maybe survive in their house if it's not heated or cooled under certain conditions, everyone has to have a place to go when things get that extreme. And we have to think about that ahead of time and create that infrastructure so that we know that every person has a place to be and a place to be safe, if and when the power goes out. And then sort of beyond that, we can have energy storage in places and for the kinds of uses that are really critical and important. So in our house, we aren't in a situation where we really depend on having electricity. It's a nuisance if the power goes out, but not threatening. But so what I have, instead of having an expensive power wall, I just have a lead acid battery under my desk that's going to power the desktop and the computer, right, the Wi-Fi, so that I'll have a few hours to finish up my work and do the things important to me when the power goes out. And those kinds of fixes are totally feasible and affordable if we just plan ahead for what's really important. We can have solar, battery powered microgrids today. That technology is absolutely off the shelf, ready to go. There's a number of regulatory hurdles, I think, to make microgrids more widespread and adopted in different kinds of configurations. But I think a lot of communities could really benefit from having a community microgrid, a place to go that might support a couple of buildings during a disaster, during an emergency, and to make sure that the important stuff gets covered.
Yeah, well, for sure. The other thing that's happening, of course, with new energies coming on is that the current system is sort of has bottlenecks in it, that a lot of projects are just sitting on the docket. They can't be done because transmission lines in some other state, have to be upgraded because we don't have any kind of central system. It's all regional systems. As we saw in the disaster in Texas, they have their own system. Texas, the Lone Star State, was hard for them because now they're, dependent on a separate grid. So, there's a problem with actually getting the projects started and then having them work into the transmission lines and then having them get to the places that the energy where the electricity needs to go. So who pays for that and how does that happen?
Oh, great question. Right. So, I mean, for the whole strategic decarbonization of our grid, the generation and transmission really goes hand in hand, because the good, inexpensive, abundant solar and wind resources, which it's good to keep in mind that in the United States, we're so blessed with natural renewable resources that there really isn't any shortage of solar or wind energy whatsoever. I mean, either could support our entire energy sector, but it would be totally impractical to do it with a single resource. But there's not a limitation on how much, sunshine and wind there is in the
But wait, there materials go into that, and there's the problem of
that's
lithium batteries and the extraction of minerals and
we'll come back to that.
destruction of
Let's
other
come back
parts
to
of the
that.
world.
Hold on. We'll come back to that. But the point I want to make is that there's an integration of generation and transmission, and you can't build the generation without the transmission, right? It doesn't make sense to put a power plant where you can't then connect it. It also doesn't make sense to invest in a transmission project if there isn't assurance that that transmission line is going to be used. So one of the issues really is how we make investment decisions and planning decisions, and whether we look at them the way we've done traditionally, sort of with a marginal cost benefit analysis to look at the business case for an individual project, which I don't think is going to get us to where we need to go. I think we need to look at it more holistically as a planning challenge for, each state and really the whole country, or at least the three electrical interconnects. As you said, there's Texas or ERCOT, and then there's the Western and the Eastern grid. And it sort of makes sense within those regional frames, I think, to look at how can we most effectively use the resources that are there and connect them to the load centers and make the whole system work. There's just a lot of externalities and econ speak of making investments in the infrastructure that benefit everyone, that you wouldn't necessarily get payback on the margin, as a private investor. So I think, now your next question, who pays for it? Traditionally, we've paid for investments in the electric grid for, capacity additions through electric rates, right? There's an established process for rate basing these infrastructure investments. And I think one problem with that is that when you look at electricity bills, the same monthly utility bill that's an existential threat for one family is pocket change for another family. And that kind of tells you that it's a difficult way, even though there are, there's adjustments for low income electric rates, that's a minor adjustment compared to the income and wealth inequality that we have in our country. So I don't think electricity rates are a strong instrument really for supporting the big transition that we need. I think it needs to be publicly funded with tax dollars rather than rate dollars.
We have this big infrastructure bill that's just passed with billions of dollars supposedly going to this very sort of thing. Do you have hopes that that's going to actually go where it should go and work?
I certainly do have very high hopes. Yes. And, I mean, I'm very happy that bill was passed, and there's so much great stuff in it. There's so much more great stuff that wasn't realistic to put in it. And I mean, just to take California, for example, we have great climate goals. We are sort of on the bleeding edge of committing to, we're going to do this transition. And yet even here, where you have a bunch of really, really committed people and organizations and institutions, we're still sort of lacking the framework for getting everybody coordinated on the same page. It's still a little bit chaotic because, we've never historically attempted such a profound change on this society scale, a societal scale that touches everything else, right? We've done incredible things. We, landed people on the moon. We've accomplished amazing things, but I think transitioning our energy system is the biggest, boldest adventure yet, and it's going to affect everyone, and it needs everyone and different agencies and institutions to work together. So my hope is that the sense of urgency that we have because of the disasters, because of the obvious threat of climate change in our faces now, that's going to galvanize really the political will and commitment to say that, this is not about party politics. This is about making sure that we're safe and sound and prepared. It's really about homeland security as much as anything.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. I liked what you had to say about the people first, because we sometimes forget that people have lived for hundreds of thousands of years before electricity, before fossil fuels. We can exist. We've just become so dependent. Our society's become so fragile with its dependence on technology. But to be able to look at, how could we, protect people while what's going to happen is going to happen. It's very clear that we've baked in some very serious catastrophic events, and they're not going to be averted. So, we need to prepare for these kinds of things. And we'll have to just see how where the renewable energy is going to be the panacea, or whether it's going to, help us mildly through this transition. I don't know, but.
So, Adele, you brought up another really good point, and, that was about the really the life cycle cost, or the footprint, all the inputs, the material inputs that go into making batteries, for instance, or building all this equipment that we'll need. And I wanted to sort of come back to that because it's an important concern. So two things I like to say. One thing about batteries, which is that there are certainly, rare earths or minerals in many of the sort of today's off-the-shelf products that
in all our
either
infrastructure.
Pardon?
In everything.
In everything, right? So that when you say, okay, if can we scale this up indefinitely? Maybe not. There's question about lithium, there's cobalt, and other things. So one thing that I'm very hopeful about is the fact that a lot of really smart people are working on many different battery chemistries. And as we are committing to this more electricity-based infrastructure with storage, energy storage and batteries, swapping out batteries is relatively easy to do, right? The transition from today's fossil fuel system to a really sustainable, renewable-based system. The hard part is the electrification. Swapping out a different style or technology of battery is going to be pretty easy, so that it's not necessary to say, today's batteries are exactly the technology that's going to provide storage, electricity storage, because there are, in fact, many other options, many other chemistries. The other thing I want to say is that I think with the renewable energy technologies, we have a tendency to put them under a microscope and compare them by much tougher standards and criteria than have ever been applied to other things that we use. And that's not wrong. I mean, I think
Because we were so unconscious of what we were doing
we
all
were
the time.
so
We were
clueless. I
ignoring
mean,
that we were just destroying the world in order to have our houses and our cars and
we
we
meant
just did it,
well. We meant well. It seemed like a good idea at
really.
the time to burn as much petroleum as we possibly could as fast as we could, right? I mean, there are people who sincerely in their hearts believed that they were doing society a favor by accelerating the use of fossil fuels. Well, today we know
Well,
that was mistaken. Okay.
they did know that the damage they were doing, that we know from reports that they already knew that they were going to be wrecking the planet, and they were still putting out. But
Well,
okay,
this
there may
was
be some people who
certainly
are innocent
this.
in that industry. One has to be fair, I suppose. But by and
Yeah, and
large,
I think we're talking about maybe different decades also. But yes, I mean, your point is well taken, the merchants of doubt,
they knew
right?
decades ago. They knew this
Sure,
decades ago.
sure. But so, so the question about what criteria and standards do you apply? I think it's correct to apply the tough standards to say, is a technology sustainable, or up to what level, what scale, and what time frame are we talking about that this, is workable? What are the sort of cumulative long-term costs? What is the energy footprint? And one example is manufacturing photovoltaics, where in the early days, monocrystalline silicon cells took a lot of energy to manufacture. And so a criticism was, well, geez, if what is the energy payback here? Will this cell even produce as much energy in its lifetime in the sun as what it took to manufacture it? Well, the answer is yes, but it took a few years. Today's manufacturing manufacturing technologies, just for the purpose of cutting costs, are way, way, way more efficient, thinner film cells and so forth. So today's cells pay for themselves within months, right, of being out in the sun. But those are correct questions to ask. They've never been asked of some of the other technologies. So when you're comparing, for example, an EV against a gasoline internal combustion engine car, you can't just look at the manufacturing of the EV and the battery versus the gasoline that car burns. You have to look at the entire.
People are, and it's considerably more. So that's been one of the things that's been leveled against EVs.
But so then, are we including the refineries? Are we including the steel? Are we
I mean,
including
sure,
all the
no argument
infrastructure
there. I
that
mean, the
goes
fossil fuel
into making
industry,
everything?
we needed to go away, and there's nobody that's saying it doesn't, except for the extreme right-wing deniers who are madly saying that. But we want to do something good here, and there is concern. As you say, we have always been unconscious, but that doesn't mean we should continue to be unconscious
Right.
of what we're doing. So, we'll have to see going forward how well we can make a transition in our society, and whether or not, some people can continue to live with a lot and most of the world lives with a little. This is not really at all fair. The global South is screaming at us, and they want the energy too, so there's only so many resources in a finite planet. And, we can't just continue to dream that we can go on and on and on. We have to think about producing less stuff and not making ridiculous things. And what are the real needs, which you've mentioned as well? What are the real needs of society versus, ridiculous luxuries, which is a lot of what we have really in this part of the world. We need fewer people using less. And there's really no getting around that.
Ultimately there is not. And that is such a big and such a difficult conversation. I mean, I could say flippantly, well, that's above my pay grade, right? That is definitely not an engineering question, but it's undeniably the case that at some point in doing really coherent, consistent response to climate change, it needs to be a global response. It needs to be on the basis of unity as humankind, right? Not just individual countries, because the atmosphere doesn't care, the weather doesn't care where the, state borders are. And I mean, one example too, where we're seeing this is with resources like, fisheries that are impacted, that, it's a global problem. The oceans are a global problem, not a national problem. And, ultimately you can't make a solid plan for the future without some equity. The conversation about equity is in there. And so it's very difficult, and I don't envy the folks who go who negotiate, about how do you address past unfairness and acknowledge that and incorporate that into future agreements. I mean, the question, and this is going to come up, in terms of, is there anyone who could be held legally accountable, whether it's a corporation or a country, who could be held accountable for things like an island nation is going to be flooded and has to move and can no longer farm there, can no longer live there. Who is to be held accountable for that? Is anyone? Really?
Yes, well,
tough
that's the
questions.
million-dollar question, the billion-dollar question. Are we going to be fair to the refugees that we've created? And are we going to be able to accommodate them in the future? Sascha, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I really thank you for joining us on Facing Future.
Thank you, Dale. My pleasure.